the fellow travelers, Mark with
Rob from Trip Hacks DC.
And today we're going to talk about tourist traps here in DC, but it's not really tourist traps in DC. It's more being trapped as a tourist here in DC is something you need to know about. And Rob is a fantastic guide here. If you want to check him out, go to Trip Hacks DC on YouTube or triphacksdc.com and get all kinds of videos on DC. And the thing is, it's not really a ton of tourist traps here, are there?
No, I mean, we don't really have like the equivalent of Times Square or a big tourist trap like that here in DC.
Yeah, I mean, here it's more you're being trapped as a tourist or in a tourist situation. I think probably the biggest trapped as a tourist situation you're going to get into is if you kind of get stuck in a crowd going into an exhibit or going into a museum because there's so many people entering at one time. And so one thing that's really important is if you're coming to DC, make sure you plan out your day that you're starting early, okay? If you go early in the morning, like my mom and I went to the Daughters of American Revolution museums this morning. It opened at 8:30. There was nobody there. We got to enjoy ourselves there and got to work that way. Because if you come in the afternoon,
it gets crowded, and you got to be expecting those crowds.
Yeah, so think about it that way, because you don't want to get stuck like that. Now, what's another thing they should look out for?
So it's not really a tourist trap, but you could get trapped if you sign up for a tour that doesn't actually have a human tour guide. And this is unfortunate because during COVID in 2020, 2021, a lot of tour companies had to close. And some of them, when they reopened, they were running buses and they were running transportation, but they didn't bring back their human tour guide. And so, to me, a tour is a person like me, your tour guide, showing you around. And so, when it's just a bus ride or just driving around looking at stuff, it's transportation. It's not a tour anymore.
And it's expensive transportation.
Expensive transportation, because you can ride the circulator bus for very cheap.
Yes, that is very true. I think since we're here near the National Mall, and I think another thing as a tourist trappy kind of thing is if you're going to be eating anywhere near the National Mall, it's not really there's not a lot of good options around here, wouldn't you say?
When you're walking around the National Mall, you're not going to see restaurants on the side of the road. There are food trucks and there are some concession stands, but these are not places where you're going to sit down or even places where you're going to, go up and get counter service or anything like that. So the restaurants, the places where you might want to eat are going to be a little bit off of the National Mall when you're down here.
So do plan your day accordingly. So maybe have that big breakfast, then come in to enjoy here. You can grab some stuff. You can grab some stuff from the people, the trucks and stuff, but you're kind of trapped in that. So go and explore more and plan your meals around that. So I know I talked about getting stuck in that big group trying to get into a museum or within a museum, but also just the line going into the museum. In the pre-COVID days, there was a lot of times a second entrance, right?
Yeah, so in the before times, many of the museums had two sets of doors. One would be on the side facing the National Mall, the big grassy area, and then the other would be on Independence Avenue or Constitution Avenue, depending on which side of the National Mall you were on. And a lot of times, because the school groups would go in on the National Mall side, if you went around to the other side of the building, you could skip that line.
That was my favorite tip he gave me when we came here a few years ago because it saved so many headaches. And hopefully, when they get enough people working again, they'll open up those secondary entrances. Now, the thing is when you go traveling, any big city, all big cities have, not necessarily tourist traps, there's scams you got to look out for. Just like anywhere, you're not going to be making change for anybody, okay? There's banks that do that. You don't give your phone to anyone. They may say, I need to make a phone call. Guess what? You can find other phones, okay? They don't need to use your phones. Stay away from anything like that. The typical tourist scams, they're here too. It's not like we're away from that just because we're in the capital.
Yeah, we're lucky that we don't have as many as other big world cities, but if anybody asks you to make change, you don't owe anyone change. If anyone tries to hand you something on the street, or especially if they try to hand your kids some junk on the street, don't take it because they're just going to want you to give them something in return.
Yep. So another kind of being trapped as a tourist thing is also sometimes your mentality, because when you think about coming to D.C. or the district, you think about, I want to be by the mall, I want to see by the White House, and I want to see the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial. And the thing is, you trap yourself in staying by the National Mall, and I think that's something you want to have different options for, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think it's great if you want to stay near the National Mall. Staying near the White House is actually one of my top recommendations, but I know that that's not for everybody, and if you don't want to stay right next to the White House or right next to the National Mall, there are lots of other options. I actually have 11 areas of the city that I recommend, and so you can check that out over at triphacksdc.com/hotels, and hopefully one of those 11 areas will suit your needs.
Exactly. Now, another thing that's really cool is when you come here to DC, there's so much free stuff. There's more free galleries and museums and exhibits and all kinds of things that you sometimes get sucked into, I'm only going to do free stuff. And I think that's a tourist mistake they make, is you got to realize sometimes you got to kind of like a balance, right? Like, it's free, but then there's some stuff that's worth paying for. Like my mother and I, we just went to the International Spy Museum. It wasn't free, but it was worth every penny. And so when you're planning out your time here and your budget here, make sure you kind of balance the like, do I pay versus free, and what you really want to see.
And I love free. I think some of the best things in the city are free, but sometimes there are things that are worth the splurge, and whether that's a fancy restaurant, a chef's tasting menu, or having a tour guide show you around the sites, which are already free, and you don't have to do it. There's no rule that says you have to, but plenty of people have found that it's a great experience that is worth it.
Yeah. My tummy's rumbling. So any tourist things I need to think about?
So when it comes to restaurants are hard. They're really hard. And I say that because you've really got to keep up with the restaurant scene. Yeah. And this is one of the things that's really tricky is the last time you came to DC, we were just talking about, was 3 years ago. And you might have eaten at some great restaurants 3 years ago, and the restaurant might have closed, or it might have lost its luster, or the chef might have moved on to a new project. And so if you return to that same restaurant, you might not get the same great experience. You want to move on to the next great experience. And so keep up with the local food scene from people who actually live here and write about it and study it.
Yeah, because your guidebook that was written 4 years ago, that was published 2 years ago, probably not going to be as helpful as someone like Rob or some of the other locals you'll talk to. Now, another thing I think is in terms of a tourist trap, this is one that I've had both times I've come here in the last few years with you and my mom, my family, and even when I was a kid and we used to come here, is you get trapped in thinking, I've got to do everything, right? I mean, I'm sure you have that sometimes with some of your tour groups, right?
One of the hardest things to tell someone is that when they're coming to DC and they're only here for a few days, they can't do everything. You just can't. You just can't do it. And you need at least a week to do most of the big things, let alone the hidden gems and some of the smaller things. And then,
God forbid you want to do a day trip.
A day trip. Yeah, you got to be here for enough days to make a day trip worthwhile. And then, of course, there's the season. Some things are seasonal. And so even if you come in the summer, you might not do the winter stuff. And if you come in the winter, you might not do the summer stuff. So you're probably going to have to make more than one trip to DC.
That's right. And so I want to say thanks to Rob. Tell him again where they can find you.
TripHacksDC.com or TripHacksDC on YouTube. And I'm sure Mark will be generous enough to put links to all of those things in the video description.
So if you want to see more stuff with Rob, I actually got a couple of his videos, which will be somewhere around here. Also, if you see his beautiful face or the link there for TripHacksDC, click on that so you can go see his channel, subscribe. And if you're going to go to DC, he is the man you need to talk to. Bye from here in DC.
Bye.